The Kansas Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired was founded in 1920. The Kansas Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired is celebrating its 100th anniversary. We have captured the life stories of some of our members, talking about the barriers they have had to face in terms both of discrimination and in employment situations.
My name is Michael Byington, and I am legally blind from birth, as many members of our organization experience some vision, but not nearly as much as a fully sighted person has. I'm kind of at the top end of legal blindness, but in order to get the best mileage out of the vision that I have, I wear a rather unique looking device up here called a lens-mounted bioptic, and that gives me pretty good distance vision in a fairly narrow area. It does not allow me to function as a sighted person, but it does help me to do some things that I would not have been able to do otherwise, and that as a child I was told that I would not be able to do. And I think that my status has had a lot to do with a number of things I've gotten into and a number of jobs that I have gotten into. But I do have to give my mother credit for my irascible nature. My mother was legally blind and had maybe not quite half as much vision as I do. She spent 12 years at the School for the Blind in Kansas, which I will continue to say is a fine institution that is doing some incredible work today. So in no way would I be critical of that organization simply because I managed to make it all the way through public school without having to go to the School for the Blind. But I do owe a lot of that to my mother, because while she got a good education at the School for the Blind and went on to get a couple of college degrees and so on, and worked professionally in a number of jobs, including that of newspaper reporter, which was rather unusual at the time for a person who's blind. She's been dead for some years now, which is why she's not telling this story. But she did sort of move her reporting career to part-time because she had this kid. And my parents had gone to a 1950s model genetic counselor before they got married, and he looked at their medical records and said, well, no, neither of you have visual conditions that should cause you to have a visually impaired child. I think you're very clear to having children. I'm an only child because when I was born, not that they minded being visually impaired, but they found out that the genetic counselor of the 1950s didn't know everything. I have lower acuity vision, and that's different than people who lose their field of vision. I have a full field where I can see both of my hands as I place them beside my face. I just can't see much detail any further than that. So I wear this gadget here because it gives me good detail vision in a fairly narrow area. You have to learn to use that and to know when to get in and out of it, and I took all of that training. And in Kansas, when I turned 16 in 1970, there was a lot of buzz among low vision optometric personnel as to whether a person who had this kind of vision should be able to, with restrictions, drive an automobile. And I decided I wanted to be the first test case to see if this could possibly work. And when I explained all this to my mother, she said, well, that's fine. I think you should go for it. There's the typewriter over there. You need to start writing letters to people. And it was like, well, Mom, why don't you help me do this? She said, because you're going to have to do it. She also, I might add, sent me to a low vision consultation without going with me. I went alone at the age of 15. And there were those who thought she was being neglectful or abusive as a parent for having taken that stance. But her view was, and I am in deep agreement with it, that it's better off if you're low vision or blind to learn to advocate for yourself and to speak for yourself young, because you are going to have to do it all of your life. And I think I probably became the first person in Kansas to drive with a bioptic correction and with a lot of restrictions because I am the one who advocated for it. And the folks at the Driver's License Bureau were really kind of taken aback when this 17-year-old kid, I didn't get the full license until I was 18, walked into the Director of Motor Vehicles and said, "I want to show you what I can do," after having written my own letter to make the appointment. I have now been a licensed driver in the state of Kansas for 46 years. And during that time, let me tell you, when the legislators pass a law that somebody with a disability ought to be able to do something, you can pretty well bet that somebody's going to have a different idea and that law is going to change a few years later. They keep diddling with that kind of stuff. And so I have never known what I was going to encounter when I had to go renew my driver's license. But I had managed for a number of years to go in and simply give them the license. Sometimes they discussed with each other, well, do we need to give him another behind-the-wheel test or anything like that? I don't know what to do. Oh, just give him his license and send him on. He's got a good driving record, and my driving record continues to be pretty good. I did have to take private driving lessons because the high school I was in certainly didn't want to let me into driver's ed. But quite a few years now, it was under Joan Finney's administration. Joan Finney had appointed this gal, and I do not remember her name, but she was one of Joan Finney's old bridge playing friends. I'm sure she had some professional credentials. But they put her into the role of the Director of Motor Vehicles. And she was a smoker. And that's only relevant because of the conversation I remember having with her, and the fact that I can pretty well imitate her voice. Very deep for a lady. I went in to take my driver's test, and I'd been driving about 20 or 25 years, but I had to renew my license. And they said, oh, well, the new Director of Motor Vehicles has adopted a new provision. You now have to take a behind-the-wheel driver's test, possibly even every year. Well, now, I'm not a terrible driver, and I use my bioptic really well, but let's face it, most people find taking a driver's test to be somewhat analogous to going to the dentist and having a root canal. It's not something that people find real pleasant to do, even if they have a perfect driving record and no problems at all. So I said, well, you can't do that because the Americans with Disabilities Act passed a couple of years ago. This was about 1992. And it says that a person who has been found qualified cannot have to have different testing than anybody else in order to have the same right or privilege. And the people behind the counter said, well, I'm not sure what to do about that. Let's try to call the Director of Motor Vehicles. And they put me on the phone with her, and she said, Mr. Byington, if you wish to sue my butt because I want you to take a behind-the-wheel test, you go right ahead and sue my butt. And you might even whip my butt. However, today, you will walk out of that office without having a driver's license. Now, take your choice. Use the new civil rights that the ADA has given you, or take the damn driver's test. I took the test. And the lady who tested me was so impressed with my driving, she said, you know what? I think I'm going to take your restrictions off of your license. You don't need those on there anymore. And I said, well, actually, I think my restrictions are fair. I don't think I've got any business on major highways or in like major cloverleafs around Kansas City. She said, you know what, you probably don't. I'm not telling you should drive anywhere you want to. I'm telling you that I think you can far more logically restrict yourself than I can know what restrictions to put on your license. But if you go to Kansas City and cause a major accident on the cloverleafs, somebody's going to look at your records and ask you why the heck you were trying to do that. So I think I'm sort of, kind of, a licensed driver like anybody else is now, except during the Sam Brownback administration, this, by the way, was all lifted during Bill Graves' administration, but during the Sam Brownback administration, it was decided that people who have any type of a disability that challenges their vision should be tested at least every time they renew their driver's license. And I tried the same challenge and didn't get anything quite as colorful as a result, but decided that sometimes civil rights issues are not worth pursuing, even though I have been a civil rights advocate all of my life. The thing that is still probably discriminatory is that even though my vision tests out the same at the age of 64, going on 65, that it did back when I was 16, I now have been told by the Brownback administration, and Governor Kelly has not yet seemed to change this, that I have to go in every year and have my low vision optometrist write a report about my vision. And we've gotten to be pretty good buddies. She's glad to see me again, but I do have to spend that extra money to do it. And given the fact that this all started when I was working more in Wichita than I was working up here, and I have chosen not to change doctors, since I don't drive myself, I have to pay a driver or take the bus and go down to Wichita every year to have a little confab with the low vision optometrist and pay a lot of extra money simply because I have a visual impairment. And this is the way that, despite all of the discrimination that is out there, discrimination still does sometimes prevail in unique ways. Now, as far as what I have done professionally over the years, I've always had the good fortune to be employed doing something. I have worked in the rehabilitation area. I did get a master's degree first in communications, and so I taught college classes for a few years, worked in the rehabilitation field. But when I got to be in my low 50s, I was kind of, early 50s, I was kind of running out of things that people wanted to hire me and pay me very much to do. I had been working most recently as a dormitory superintendent at the Rehab Center for the Blind and Visually Impaired here in Kansas when Governor Sebelius chose to close that facility. It actually didn't close until Governor Parkinson was in charge of things, but he didn't choose to change that. And so I knew that I was going to become unemployed at that time. And having done some lobbying work in my past, I could see the handwriting on the walls that no matter what kind of activity the Kansas Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired and other advocates did, the legislature was probably going to close it this time. We had fought that battle before successfully, but this time it wasn't going to go. So I, at the age of 55, went back to work on a second graduate degree to get a certification in orientation and mobility training for people who are blind and visually impaired. And I was successful in completing that degree. I worked for several years for Envision in Wichita, doing that work on a full-time basis, and then retired from there. And for the last couple of years, I have taught school kids who are mainstreamed or in the public schools, not at the School for the Blind, how to travel around their school and in their community. I enjoy doing that work very much, and I've managed to do it now from the age of 62 on, and apparently somebody thinks I know how to do it because they're still having me do it. The thing I think that I would observe about that, which relates to some of the topics that we've been talking about here today, with the jobs that people who are blind and visually impaired do, and also the discrimination that they experience, is that back in 1958, when the certification for orientation and mobility was first created, a blind gentleman working for the VA who actually started blind services in the VA, very smart guy named Russ Williamson, who was a very good traveler, suggested at a meeting of one of the professional associations, well, I don't think maybe blind people or people who are legally blind ought to be certified to teach orientation and mobility. There's two issues that we need to be concerned about here. Is one would be their ability to protect other people who are their students. And the second issue is, what if the client became better at traveling than the instructor? And my response to that is, wow, if I can make a student better at what I do than I'm doing it, I'm delighted about that. That's wonderful. But that wasn't the way they saw it. And so from 1958 to 1994, there were a few changes made in the regulations so people with maybe a little vision loss could teach orientation mobility. When they started out, it took as much vision as it took to fly a jet airplane to be an orientation and mobility instructor. Well, they backed it off and backed it off and backed it off. And finally, in 1994, it became legal, if they could prove that they could meet the requirements and do the work, for people who were blind or legally blind to become certified orientation and mobility specialist, and to have that credential and to teach in the schools and to teach adults in rehabilitation centers, etc. But it's kind of ironic. I feel like the last 10 years of my life or so, I finally figured out what I wanted to do when I grew up. But you know what? Because of the discrimination that was out there, I couldn't have gotten an opportunity to do that until I was the age of 40. So that's just a little bit about the way I've felt that discrimination has affected my life. I can't say that I ever found that I was discriminated against tremendously as a college instructor or working in the rehabilitation field, but discrimination is something that anyone with a disability still does face. The ADA is not going to solve it all, and all we can do is keep advocating and keep trying to make it better for the next generation. And thank you very much.
Yay. Learn more about KABVI at KABVI.com.